Okay, welcome to class number 2, where we start for real trying to understand René Descartes. So, of course, I have to introduce Descartes first of all. He does have an accent aigu. If you've studied French, you know what I mean, René. He was active during the 1620s until he died in 1651. His most famous book is what we're going to read, Meditations on First Philosophy. We have to unpack that title, of course. That book was published in 1641. But that isn't all. He also wrote other books. For example, he wrote a very important work in geometry, which was just called the French Géométrie. This was a book that was written in Latin and written in French and translated into Latin, and which was read by many mathematicians and philosophers. Remember, they were all one big group for the most part, in later years, including a young man named Isaac Newton. This was really the sort of most important textbook in geometry that had been written in the 17th century, I think it's fair to say, at least according to many points of view. And so Descartes was certainly known as a very famous mathematician, or geometer, as he would have been called. He also wrote Discourse on Method, which you may have heard of, Passions of the Soul, a whole series of other works. He had a very, very extensive correspondence with various people in England and throughout Europe. So he was a famous man in his own day. But it was the Meditations that was most influential and important. So we're going to talk about that in great depth. I'll just tell you about one other text first. A couple of years after the Meditations was published, 1644, he wrote a book called Principia Philosophiae, or Principles of Philosophy. This was his great work in natural philosophy. It's his work in what we've called natural philosophy. It's his attempt to understand nature as a whole, the earth, the motions of the planetary bodies, heat and magnetism and all kinds of phenomena on the earth, and a whole host of other problems, all in one great work. It was a very important work for Leibniz and for Isaac Newton and for numerous other thinkers well into the 18th century. It spawned a whole series of other textbooks in natural philosophy that were Cartesian in one way or another. And one of the interesting things about Descartes is, as I say, he was famous during his lifetime. And the word Cartesianism was actually invented during his lifetime by a very important English theologian and philosopher named Henry Moore. And so people were Cartesians throughout the second half of the 17th century and well into the 18th century. Anyway, this bears a little bit of remarking on before we move on, because the story of the Principles of Philosophy is actually rather interesting. It takes us backwards in time to Galileo. The story of Descartes goes back to Galileo for an important reason. You may recall that in 1633, Galileo was placed under house arrest by the Vatican, by the Pope, for articulating and defending a Copernican view of the solar system, for saying that the Earth moves, first of all, for saying that the Earth is not the center of the universe, second of all, and for saying that the sun is the center of the solar system. So in 1633, a relatively young Descartes, or middle-aged Descartes, wrote a letter to a very important thinker of that time, Mersenne, and he said he was about to publish a book in natural philosophy that also articulated a Copernican view of the world. That book was simply known as Le Monde, or The World, written in French, Descartes' native language. But Descartes withdrew it from publication. He said, look, if Galileo was placed under house arrest because he articulated a Copernican view, then surely I'll be in trouble as well if I articulate a Copernican view, which I have done in this unpublished work, Le Monde, so I withdraw it from publication. So Le Monde never saw the light of day, even though it was ready to be published in 1633. Now, this is a very interesting incident because it leads to all kinds of views about the relation between science and religion, philosophy and science, philosophy and religion. A lot of what you hear about the Galileo trial, the Galileo house arrest, Copernicanism, etc., is probably not historically accurate. And for various reasons, I don't want to go into that now, but if you're ever interested, we could talk about it in office hours or on the side. Anyway, Descartes really was very struck by the house arrest of Galileo. That is historically true. Some people think he was overreacting because Descartes was actually living in Holland at that time, which was not a Catholic country, not under the control of the Vatican, the way much of Italy was. And most importantly, Holland was a sort of free-thinking society, the way it's always been in some ways. And he could have published works there that would not have been under the control of various forces in the Vatican or in Italy. But in any case, Descartes decided not to do that, so he didn't publish Le Monde. And it was almost 10 years, in fact, it was more than 10 years later, before he ever published a work in natural philosophy, The Principles of Philosophy. He changed his philosophical maneuver anyway, if not his fundamental position. He decided to publish the Meditations first, and the Principles of Philosophy, the natural philosophical treatise, second, whereas his original plan was to publish Le Monde, the book in natural philosophy, first, and then deal with metaphysics or first philosophy later. So that, of course, raises our first question. What does it mean, Meditations on first philosophy? What does metaphysics mean? How does that relate to epistemology, which came up in our first lecture, etc.? Well, that's what we're going to deal with first. And I lost my eraser. Here it is. So that's your background. Let's focus in on this now. Meditations on first philosophy. Of course, you want to know why did he write Meditations? We'll deal with that later. First, we'll try to figure out the rest of this title. It's always good to know what the title of a book means, isn't it? Well, first philosophy, as it turns out, is another name for metaphysics. So what's metaphysics? Well, as the title suggests, it is a meta-level physics, or a meta-level or prior discipline to physics. What is that supposed to mean? Well, in fact, this term came from the codification of the Aristotelian corpus. I don't know if you can read that. Metaphysica is the Latin term, and the reason is they took the physics of Aristotle and put that first, and the metaphysics came second. So it actually, in this case, meant after the physics. That isn't very helpful for our purposes, but it is historically relevant. For our purposes, metaphysics concerns the following set of issues. And the way to do it for our purposes actually is to distinguish it from natural philosophy. So natural philosophy, we said, was the systematic study of the natural world, including the human being. Metaphysics would be the study of other things beyond the natural world, including, for example, God and the soul and freedom as a concept and immortality as a concept. These are classic notions within metaphysics. Now, this is a nice little distinction, but like most nice little distinctions, the devil is in the details. And in fact, as we will see for the next month, a month and a half, in the 17th century, natural philosophy actually included discussions of God. So it would not be accurate to say that discussions of God belong exclusively in metaphysics. Discussions of God also appear in natural philosophy. Why, you might ask? I mean, what does that have to do with the study of nature? Well, everyone in this period believed that God created nature. Now we get back to a theme from our first lecture. I mentioned to you that in ancient Greece, at least from a later point of view, there was a pagan or pre-Christian philosophy. Well, that's relevant now because if you are an Aristotelian, okay, a follower of Aristotle's, and you are not Christian, if Christianity hasn't even been invented yet, then you don't necessarily have a concept of God that's of any relevance. Perhaps you have no concept at all. And you certainly don't think of nature as having been created by God. So one of the classic Aristotelian views that later thinkers had to grapple with within a Christian context is the idea that nature is eternal. Now, of course, if you believe in Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, you think the world was created. And you think, therefore, the world was not eternal. At least nature was not eternal. Maybe God is eternal. But nature or the natural world is not eternal. The earth is not eternal. It was created at a certain point in time. So that already distinguishes Aristotelian natural philosophy, which may have no use for the concept of God at all, from later natural philosophy of the kind that we're going to study, where the concept of God is actually relevant. Okay, so metaphysics deals with God and natural philosophy does too. So what's the difference? How do you distinguish natural philosophy from metaphysics? Well, metaphysics deals with God not in relation to nature, whereas natural philosophy is primarily concerned with God's relation to nature as the creator of the world, and as we'll see later, for example, as the being who created the laws of nature, the laws of motion and the other laws of nature. So metaphysics concerns God and the soul and freedom and immortality, but not in relation to nature. That's one way to understand the distinction. So the Meditations on First Philosophy was a work in metaphysics, and it was not a work primarily in natural philosophy. That was what came a few years later in the Principles of Philosophy, which supplanted Le Monde, as I said before. Okay, but what does all of this tell us about Descartes' work in Meditations? So, in the Meditations, that's what we want to find out in more depth. Well, the great thing about the Meditations, and this is one reason it's been taught for so many generations, is that he's very clear, at least in a general way, about what he's up to. For example, when you open the book, and I don't think you can read this, but I'm pointing to the headlines here, as it were. When you open the book, he tells you very, very clearly what his aim is. So we're on page 12 of this edition, if you have it with you. This is how class is going to work in general, okay? It's called Meditations on First Philosophy, in which are demonstrated the existence of God and the distinction between the human soul and the body, okay? So, Cartesian metaphysics at least concerns two things: the existence of God and the distinction of the soul and the body. Now, as I said before, natural philosophy includes the study of the human being. And if you're a natural philosopher, you would study the body in and of itself. For example, you would study one of the great topics of the 17th century, whether the blood circulates. This was discovered, as you may know, by William Harvey, although he wasn't the only one to talk about it in this era. And it's one of the topics in natural philosophy. So a natural philosopher would treat the body in connection to nature, the rest of nature. Does the blood circulate in other mammals? How does that work? Now you're scratching your head and you're saying, well, that was a bit literal. Anyway, you're saying, well, that sounds like biology or something. Well, yes, but biology didn't exist. Of course, they could have the word because bio and logos could come from Greek, but as a discipline, a scientific discipline, biology didn't exist. This is not only pre-Darwin, but it's even pre-Linnaeus. It's before the classification of biological organisms in the 18th century. So a natural philosopher would study the body in connection to the rest of nature, okay? But a metaphysician, a philosopher who's doing metaphysics like Descartes, would study the distinction, he says, between the soul and the body. That's something he wants you to realize, that the soul or the mind is a distinct entity from the body. That's a classic topic in metaphysics. And of course, he wants to tell you that the soul or the mind is immortal in some sense, has immortality, but the body, of course, dies. Then you have the existence of God as another crucial topic. Again, we want to know, but what makes the existence of God a topic in metaphysics as opposed, say, to theology? After all, a theologian, or just any old religious thinker, even without training in theology, might be interested in the existence of God. What makes it metaphysics? Well, Descartes himself tells us about this. He makes a very, very classic distinction that pre-exists him between reason and faith. And he tells us that earlier on in the dedicatory letter to the Faculty of Theology at Paris, which still exists to this day, of course. He says that already in the second paragraph. So now we're back on page 3. And there are marginal numbers actually in the margins, obviously. That's where marginal numbers are. If you look at marginal number 2, you'll see it there. Second paragraph. I have always thought that two topics, namely God and the soul, are prime examples of subjects where demonstrative proofs ought to be given with the aid of philosophy rather than theology. Right? For us who are believers, it's enough to accept on faith that the human soul does not die with the body and that God exists. Okay, that's just the two topics we've been talking about. But in the case of unbelievers, it seems that there is no religion that they can be persuaded to adopt until these two truths are proved to them by natural reason. So that's the key. Metaphysics uses reason. And so if you were dealing with theology, you might be able to use faith to talk about God or the soul. If you were doing natural philosophy, you'd be talking about the body in relation to nature and God's relation to nature. But metaphysics is about God and the soul using reason, not in relation to nature and using reason. Okay? That's a sketch of what this book is about, Meditations on First Philosophy. What does it mean to use reason? Descartes is not going to appeal to Christian doctrine, Catholicism, Protestantism, etc. So it doesn't matter what your religious views are to read this book. Okay? First, that's the first point. Second of all, Descartes is going to make arguments, what we call arguments in philosophy, to try to convince you of his conclusions. And in fact, he doesn't hesitate to use the word proof when dealing with the existence of God. So he is going to try to give a proof in the third meditation for the existence of God, a very famous argument. So this doesn't presuppose faith, and it doesn't deal with God's relation to nature. It deals with the existence of God per se, and it tries to give a proof for the existence of God using reason. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what metaphysics is, or first philosophy. Sorry, I have a slight cold here. Now, why call it first philosophy? What's first about it? Well, there's two things to be said about that. First of all, the Meditations did come first in the sense that it was published and articulated first before the natural philosophy of the Principles, which came in 1644. And that's important because Descartes thinks he had established the existence of God and the distinction between the soul and the body and the corresponding immortality of the soul and mortality of the body in the Meditations in 1641 before the Principles of Philosophy were published in 1644. The Principles of Philosophy take off where the Meditations left off, begin where the Meditations left off. The natural philosophy in the Principles deals with the second set of issues, which is, well, what's God's relation to the world, to nature? How does God establish the laws of motion, the laws of nature? what's the relation of the body to other objects in the world, and so on. The kinds of things a natural philosopher would deal with. So that's one reason that it was called first philosophy. A second reason is that Descartes seemed to believe, and this is very important, that metaphysics would be a kind of foundation for the sciences or for natural philosophy. So what does that mean? That's something we're going to talk about a lot in the whole course. What is the relation between, in your language, philosophy and science? Which is first? Which is second? Which presupposes the other? Well, the classic Cartesian view is as follows. Metaphysics is the foundation of the sciences. So how does that work? Well, he has a famous discussion here in the preface where he talks about, I'll try to find the exact passage for you, but I know what it says, so I can tell you. He talks about the tree of knowledge, which you might have heard of. Oh, actually, it's in the preface to the Principles. I'm sorry, not in the Meditations. Anyway, in the preface to the Principles, I'll send you the passage. He talks about the tree of knowledge. And what he says is, metaphysics is the root system of the tree of knowledge, the foundation. The trunk is natural philosophy. And there are various other subjects that are the leaves and branches of the system. But for our purposes, the important point is that metaphysics is the foundation for natural philosophy. So it comes first logically, not just temporally, in the Cartesian system. It is the foundation, so it is first in that sense. And Descartes was very enamored of metaphors, like from architecture or from biology, in which you talk about metaphysics as a kind of foundation. He was a foundationalist in various ways that we will explore. Okay. We're running out of time, I can see. So, the Meditations on First Philosophy, or metaphysics, concerns the foundation of knowledge and sets up the system, the root system, that natural philosophy will grow in. You can think of it that way, to use the biological metaphor. Now, what about meditations? What does he mean by meditations? Well, as always, it's good to come up with a contrast. Meditations as opposed to what? What else would he write? Well, Descartes had written, as I've said before, a number of treatises. So this is a contrast. Okay? Descartes had written a textbook or treatise in geometry. He had written Le Monde, although it was never published at that time, which was also a treatise, in that case in natural philosophy, and he wrote other treatises as well. So he explicitly is saying that the Meditations are not a treatise, or what in Latin is called a tractatus. Well, why not? What is a treatise, and why did he decide not to write one? Well, the treatise has, I would say, one intriguing feature that the Meditations lacks. A treatise is, as it were, well, let's put it this way, rather than saying accumulation, it is the articulation of results, not paths to results. What does that mean? Well, in your textbook or your treatise, you are presented with a bunch of knowledge. For example, you're given some axioms, and then you are shown that you can deduce theorems from the axioms. Maybe there are several ways of proving a given theorem given the axioms in the system, and so on. So arguments are made on the basis of very fundamental principles like axioms and theorems. Okay, so those are the results. What you would not get are, for example, paths to results that don't really work. You would not be given proofs of a theorem that doesn't work, or that don't work, unless it's just to illustrate how you're supposed to get to the theorem. Okay, it is accumulated results that are presented in the treatise. The Meditations is very different from that. The Meditations, especially in the first meditation, presents you with a whole series of paths for thinking, many of which are dead ends. So that's one thing that it isn't, a treatise. We could talk a lot more about that, and we will during the course, but this is just the beginning. Another thing that it isn't is a dialogue. Now, Descartes did not write dialogues, but of course, in a way, the dialogue is the original philosophical literary form, since it was created, or at least used to great effect, by Plato. And the Platonic dialogues are known to philosophers, of course, through all the centuries, pretty much, with the exception of some time in the medieval period. And as a result, a philosopher could always choose to write a dialogue. That's an available literary form. We'll see that George Berkeley wrote 3 dialogues in the 18th century. That's another very nice usage of the dialogue form. Anyway, Descartes decided not to present a dialogue. So what we do not have is a series of distinct characters. Now, what's different from a treatise and a dialogue, of course, is in a dialogue, the whole point of having multiple characters is to express dead ends. Dead ends that the reader might be tempted to follow along to until he or she realizes, oh, this is a dead end. So you have a character like Socrates who helps to show another character that he's on the wrong path. But you go down the wrong path, sometimes for many, many pages. Perhaps because the author of the dialogue thinks the reader is going to be tempted to go along this false path. Well, you don't get that in a treatise. You get the results in the treatise, right? You get the proper results. You don't get the false starts and the dead ends and the misleading paths. So a dialogue is able to give you something that you don't get in a treatise, the dead ends and false starts and misleading paths. But the way that a dialogue does it, of course, is by creating multiple characters. The Meditations does not have that. Okay? The Meditations does not have multiple characters. So it isn't quite a dialogue. And it isn't quite a treatise. And as a result, it's actually a rather difficult literary form. It takes a while to get used to it. So what is it? Well, I want to say 2 things about what the Meditations is, in addition to all of this here. One of the most interesting aspects of the Meditations is that, in a way, Descartes has his cake and eats it too. He doesn't create multiple characters, but he does find a literary form, unlike a treatise, that enables him to explore dead ends, false starts, and misleading paths. It enables him not just to present the accumulated results that he has achieved, but also to take the reader on a journey in multiple ways, showing her how certain things are not going to work out and certain things are going to be successful. So it has, as it were, some of the virtues of the dialogue without actually creating multiple characters. So let's talk about that. First of all, the meditation presents failures. Not through multiple characters, but through the author's voice. Okay? And this leads us to the second point. And so it presents failures in a way that normally you would have to do using a dialogue. Second of all, it has, as it were, the author's voice in a very important way. So it uses what we will call the first person point of view. Descartes says, I did this, I did that, etc. And he does so in a way that reflects the fact that you are supposed to adopt the first person point of view. And that is something that distinguishes it, again, from a treatise or from a dialogue. So now we need our text. We need to start right at the beginning and see what's important about the literary form of the meditation as it connects to this very first paragraph. And you will see that this book is incredibly rich. You can read it and reread it, like they always say about the classics, and learn lots of new things by rereading it. And I say that now because it's very easy to read this book and learn a lot from it and write A-level essays about the book without really taking seriously the literary form that Descartes has in a way, invented for this. He's invented something that doesn't quite fit into the other forms. I could have given you a third contrast literary form, as it were, the essay, which some people think was invented by Montaigne, and who was before Descartes and would have been known to Descartes. And it's actually an interesting question how it relates to the literary form of the essay. But one way in which it seems unlike an essay is that it presents results, presents failures, presents things from a first-person point of view, and something essays often do not do, requires the reader to adopt the first-person point of view. So you might think, well, look, an essay, of course, can be written from the first-person point of view. It's my attempt to grapple with a certain subject. And hopefully you've learned in high school English or somewhere in college that the word essay ultimately or originally meant an attempt. Okay? But the reader in the Meditations must adopt a first-person point of view. It isn't like an essay where it's always the author's point of view. This is something that comes up in the second meditation very strongly, and we will see how, if you ignore this third point, that you as the reader have to adopt a first-person point of view when reading the Meditations, you will see how that's absolutely essential. And if you don't do it, you will really be unable to understand Descartes' arguments. Okay, so let's start with page 12, marginal page 17. First sentence of Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, written in 1641. Okay, the first meditation is called What Can Be Called Into Doubt. Of course, we're going to be talking about that a lot later, but for now, I'm just going to read this first paragraph, or at least the first couple sentences. Some years ago, I was struck by the large number of falsehoods that I had accepted as true in my childhood, and by the highly doubtful nature of the whole edifice that I had subsequently based them on. Take that sentence, take the key words in it, and piece them apart. I was struck. First person point of view. Okay? By the falsehoods that I had accepted in my childhood. Already mentions failures in the first sentence. We don't get the third thing yet. That'll come later. And the edifice that was built on them. Again, he's going to use a lot of metaphors. This is going to be an architectural metaphor for having certain basic beliefs, right? And that's part of a structure or an edifice that other beliefs are put on top of. And he's always going to be wondering what happens if some basic belief turns out to be false and some other belief rests on it. If that falls, the other one falls too. So he is telling you in this first sentence that a lot of what his parents taught him and a lot of what he was taught in school was wrong. This is a wonderful first sentence for an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old college student who perhaps used to think his or her parents were really great, but then after adolescence, puberty, and so on, you probably started thinking my parents are wrong all the time, and, you know, they've misled me and so on. They didn't tell me the truth, or maybe they don't know the truth, etc. It's a classic sort of human drama embodied here in this first sentence. He says, again, back to the architectural metaphors. Next sentence. I realized, first person point of view, that it was necessary once in the course of my life to demolish everything completely and start right again from the foundations if I wanted to establish anything at all in the sciences that was stable and likely to last. Now, if you know that he thinks of metaphysics as the foundation of the sciences or natural philosophy, you know that he's saying we need to redo metaphysics. We need to redo our most fundamental beliefs and ideas. So he wants to demolish the foundation of his beliefs. Okay? That's all from the first two sentences. We know that he thinks there have been a lot of failures. He believes a lot of false things. He's using the first person point of view, and he's already implicitly harking back to this idea that metaphysics or first philosophy is the foundational discipline that serves as sort of the roots for natural philosophy, the sciences, and so on. Okay, very good. Now, let's take this architectural metaphor and give it a little bit more substance. What does it mean to have a fundamental belief? What does it mean to demolish a belief? How does that relate to the title of the first meditation? What can be called into doubt? That's what we need to figure out first. Okay, I'll just read you the rest of this and then we'll move on. He says, the task looked an enormous one, and I began to wait until I should reach a mature enough age to ensure that no subsequent time of life would be more suitable for tackling such inquiries. This is why he didn't write the meditations when he was younger. He's saying, this led me to put the project off for so long that I would now be to blame if by pondering over it any further, I wasted the time still left for carrying it out. So today, I have expressly rid my mind of all worries and arranged for myself a clear stretch of free time. So you have to do that too when you read the meditations, because you're going to be taking up that third person's point of view later on, very soon. I am here quite alone, and at last I will devote myself sincerely to the general demolition of my opinions. Demolition, architectural metaphor, destroying the building and the foundations. Okay? That's the first sentence. The first paragraph of Descartes' Meditations. So, first meditation. What are the key terms? What does it look like? We're going to use the concept of doubt. We're using the concept of a basic belief, as we'll see, or a foundational belief. Okay? And we're going to engage in the demolition of our basic beliefs through the use of the concept of doubt. So what does this mean? Well, let's start with the idea in the middle, the idea of a basic belief, okay? And this is a very important aspect of Cartesian epistemology. I have to erase this because I can't use another board. It won't be seen by the camera. That's one limitation of an online course. In the real course, I could have 20 boards or at least 3. Anyway, now you might have thought that your belief system was a big amoeba, a big jumble, a big collection. This is beliefs. Actually, let's do it like this. This will be belief system alpha. That'll be Janiak's belief system, let's say. And B alpha consists of a whole bunch of beliefs. B1, B2, B3, B4, B5, B6. There's a lot of them. What do I believe? I believe today is Friday. It actually is, although your class is on Friday. I believe that Durham is located in the state of North Carolina. I believe that Duke University began in 1838 in Randolph County and eventually moved to Durham County and was renamed Duke University in 1924. I believe that my first name is Andrew. I believe that 2 + 2 = 4, etc. I believe a lot of things, and you can write them all down, and it would take a long time, but you can write them all down. It would be this big glom, this big amoeba-like thing, structureless set of propositions or beliefs that I happen to endorse. Many of them you would endorse, some of them you wouldn't, and so on. You might have thought that that's what beliefs are like. And maybe they are. That could be true. This is not the Cartesian view. The Cartesian view is that this amoeba-like thing is totally misleading. The Cartesian view is that there is a structure to your beliefs because your beliefs are logically related. What does that mean? Well, take belief system beta. According to Descartes, your beliefs form a kind of structure. And you might as well think of it in architectural terms, he says. There's my very sophisticated drawing of a house, a perfectly good architectural entity. Your beliefs form a structure such that some are the foundations for others because of their logical relations. What does that mean? Well, just to take two beliefs, I don't know if you can see that very well, but just to take two beliefs, one at the foundation, one right at the top. Descartes makes a fascinating point. He says, well, look, some of your beliefs presuppose others of your beliefs. Okay, now how would this work in detail? Well, you might say, if I believe the Pythagorean theorem, okay, which I suppose I do, that presupposes an axiom, or maybe a set of axioms. And if I didn't have the axioms, I couldn't have the theorem. Be a very simple way of understanding how some beliefs presuppose others. Okay, so the axioms of a system in geometry are a very nice paradigm of fundamental, foundational, or basic beliefs. The axioms are the basis of it, and then you get to theorems from there. Okay, what's another example? Another example is something we mentioned in our first lecture when we were talking about rationalism and empiricism. In particular, when we discussed the rationalist reaction to the empiricist view that sensory perception is the primary source of knowledge. Well, let's take that example. Let's suppose I believe that the word meditations is on this board right here. Okay? Perfectly good example of knowledge. I know that the word meditations is written here. Okay? But let's just say that it's a belief right now. The relation between belief and knowledge, of course, is something philosophers have debated a lot, and we're not going to worry about that right now. So I believe that the word meditations is here. But on what basis do I believe this? Well, I see it. Okay? Yes, but as a rationalist might tell an empiricist, especially if you're interested in the grand narrative and the history of philosophy, you'd be interested in this kind of question. How do you know that your eyes are working fine? Well, maybe my belief that the word meditations is written here presupposes my belief that my eyes are working okay today. And that belief that my eyes are working okay today could presuppose another belief, whatever it might be. In that way, you can see how one belief may presuppose another. And if you have the presupposition relation, the following thing happens. Okay? This arrow will indicate that belief 312 presupposes belief 1. Now, of course, Descartes says, look what happens. If I demolish belief 1, I demolish what is presupposed. What presupposes belief 1. I demolish belief 312. If I demolish my belief that my eyes are in good working order, I demolish every belief that presupposes that my eyes are in good working order, which is a lot. Now, this isn't a randomly chosen example. This is from the first meditation, as we'll see later. I mean, I believe all kinds of things right now, and I have every day of my life pretty much, because I believe that my eyes are in good working order. If my eyes were totally faulty and constantly misleading me, I couldn't believe all kinds of stuff. I wouldn't have a reason to think the lights are on, or the word meditations is written here. So not just B312, a whole bunch of beliefs. And that's exactly the idea. If you get a foundational belief, which is foundational in the sense that other beliefs presuppose it, and you demolish it, the structure on which it is based will come crashing down. But, there's always an important but. We have allowed this architectural metaphor to run amok, or more importantly, to take hold of what we're thinking about. Because he does use the word demolish, that's true. But the fundamental concept, as we saw briefly, is the concept of doubt. So what do you mean demolish? Aren't you supposed to do something more sophisticated and complex? Aren't you supposed to doubt a belief? The answer is yes. And that requires a lot of work. Let's go back to my example and redo this now in a more precise way using the concept of doubt. So I have my very, very fancy house here. I'm kidding, of course, with the foundation. It looks like that house in the book, what is it called? Oh, think of it. I read it to my kids. Anyway, there's a lonely house and they build a city around it. Some of you will remember. It'll come to me later. Okay, using the concept of doubt. take my basic belief, 1, and my other belief, 312. Now, this belief 1, my belief that my eyes are in good working order, say, okay? I actually think my eyes are in good working order, okay? And if you don't like that example, you can take another example, okay? But I actually don't think it's false that my eyes are working okay. I think I can see fine. I can see right now. I see the lights are on. I see a nice little room here at Duke University, etc. I see the whiteboard and the colors. Everything's cool. So I actually don't technically want to demolish my belief that my eyes are in good working order, because I think they are in good working order. But what about this more complex epistemological notion? What if I doubt that my beliefs are in good working order? That's different. It doesn't require me to say that it's false that my eyes are in good working order. It isn't false. But I can doubt true beliefs. I can doubt true propositions. I can doubt a true sentence, particularly for the purposes of doing philosophy or epistemology. So I can doubt that my eyes are in good working order, and then as a result have a reason to doubt this belief that presupposes the other one. So the relation what we're going to have here is, if you doubt B1, okay, then you have to doubt anything that presupposes B1. So we'll doubt B312, which is, remember, my belief that the word meditations is written on the board. Okay? So I'm not demolishing anything in quite the way we were saying before. That's too crude. I'm doubting a fundamental belief, and on that basis, doubting that which presupposes it. Okay, fair enough. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, that's what he says. What can be called into doubt? So that's important. Second of all, it's important because Descartes is a sophisticated epistemologist, and he knows that the beliefs you're going to doubt in the first meditation are true. Now, wait a minute. Back to scratching our heads. Why would I spend all this time doubting beliefs that are true? And what exactly does that mean? And how exactly can I do that? Can I really doubt something that's true? Well, this is a great philosophical conundrum, and it requires us to explain things in more depth. In order to understand how you can doubt a belief which is true, you have to understand something even more important. Let's take a belief. Today is Friday. That's my belief. Let's separate two aspects of this. Okay? One is truth. Is it true that today's Friday? Yes. Like, if you could see my watch, you could see, well, it doesn't say Friday, it has the date. But the computer screen over there, it says Friday, August 24th. So it's true. Today's Friday. Okay? If you don't like that example, you could say Paris is the capital of France. That's very true. And Descartes would have known that, being French. Okay. So this is true. The capital of France is Paris. Now, what else is there to a belief? Well, there's another aspect of a belief, and that is what we call justification. Now, in philosophy, we tend to think you have to distinguish between the truth of a belief and the justification of a belief. And by the latter, we mean the reasons anyone has for holding the belief. Okay? Now, what does this mean? Well, luckily, this is actually a distinction we make in ordinary life. It's just we don't quite make it in the way the philosophers do. We're not quite as precise about it. But you can understand this quite easily. Two examples will help to show you how this works. First example, we're going to go with a true belief, a belief that's true, that I have no reason for believing, no justification for. I go to the Iowa State Fair because I'm running for president or whatever, and or maybe I just like the Iowa State Fair. And there's a gigantic bottle or something, vase, something, glass jar, let's say glass jar filled with marbles. Okay? Thousands and thousands and thousands of multicolored marbles. And of course, you have to guess how many marbles there are. So I say, okay, I'll use my amazing powers of deduction. 17,412 marbles are in this jar. And the lights go off. Bing, 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 bing. You're a winner. You win the jar of marbles. Anyway, that's how many marbles there are. So it was true. 17,412 marbles. It was true. Did I have any reason for thinking that? Of course not. It was a wild guess. The very concept of a wild guess, if you try to make it more precise, presupposes the distinction between the truth of belief and its justification. It's true that there were that many marbles, but I had no reason to think that. I couldn't count them. I didn't count them, but even if I wanted to, I couldn't count them. It was a wild guess. So I had no reason to believe that there were that many marbles in the glass jar. It was a wild guess. Okay? But it was true. Second example, a false belief where you have justification. It turns out that I have gotten into some trouble with the Durham police. I've been writing a lot of letters over the years complaining about police practices in Durham. Okay? And so the police don't like me. They think Janiak is a big pain in the neck. That's not how they say it, but I've translated for a popular audience. We really can't stand this guy. He's constantly complaining. He's got the mayor on us. If you've seen The Wire, you can imagine how this works. The police commissioner is bothering us because the mayor's pressuring him because Janiak won't be quiet about our problems. So the police want to get rid of me, okay? But, of course, they can't just, get rid of me directly. That would be like a Hollywood movie. So what are they going to do? They're going to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. This is obviously a very serious topic. I'm taking it a bit lightly, but you all know about it. Conceptually, how is it possible to frame someone for a crime he didn't commit? What you are doing is taking a false belief, the belief that Janiak say robbed the bank, which is false, I didn't do it, and giving people reasons to believe the belief, giving them a justification for the belief. How do you do that? Well, you give them evidence. They go to the bank that was robbed, okay? They put my fingerprints on things. They throw my jacket in the back of the bank, okay? They had some hair from, of course I've been down to police headquarters many times. They had some hair from my head. They put that at the scene. They do a DNA analysis of the hair, etc. There are a lot of reasons to believe that I robbed the bank, but I didn't. It's a false belief for which there is a lot of evidence. It's a fundamental feature of human life, as you can see, that truth and justification do not always go together. Unfortunately, you can believe a lot of false things, even though you have a lot of reasons to believe them. You could still be wrong, okay? And you can have a lot of true beliefs for which you have no justification, no evidence, no reason to believe it. That can happen too. They come apart. If they didn't come apart, the phenomenon of the wild guess, the phenomenon of framing someone for a crime they didn't commit, etc., they couldn't exist. It would be like you couldn't give evidence that Janiak robbed the bank unless it was true that he robbed the bank. But imagine what that world would be like. The jury in American history would always be right. They couldn't ever falsely believe that someone committed a crime unless the person had actually committed the crime. Unfortunately, in that case, that's not true. That's not how it works, as you know. So truth and justification are different. Now the key to everything, to understand Descartes' first meditation, you presuppose this distinction and you realize that we are going to 100% ignore the truth. Descartes is going to take a bunch of true beliefs, like the belief that my eyes are in good working order, and get you to doubt them. And what that means is he's going to get you to focus on the reasons for holding the belief. And he's going to say you don't have a good reason to hold that belief, even though it's true. Okay? So let's go back to our architecture, our little house. Put this all together. We say the following. Here's my house. It's getting worse each time. I'm moving down in the world. I don't know. B1, basic belief. It's true. Fine. It's true that my eyes are in good working order. But the justification or reasons for holding it, they can be undermined. How? If you give me a reason to doubt. B1. If you give me a reason to doubt the belief, you can undermine my justification for it. Okay? That says reason to doubt my belief. I now say, well, maybe I don't have any reason to believe B1 anymore. That does nothing to the truth of the belief. The truth is separate. Okay? So we're going to deal with true beliefs, but we're really not going to worry about the fact that they're true. We're going to worry about the justification or reasons. Now the cell phone is going off, which I didn't think would happen. So I have to stop this. Sorry. Stop the cell phone. Okay. That's one problem with the online course. Actually, that's what happens in the real course too. So we're not going to touch the truth of the belief. We're going to focus on the reasons to believe it, the justification for it. Okay? And that's perfectly coherent because of what we were just saying. So for example, it's false that I robbed the bank, but you can have reason to believe it. Now suppose I did rob the bank. Suppose it's true that I robbed the bank. Okay? Different scenario. I did rob the bank. That's true. Fine. Does that mean anyone has a reason to believe it? Maybe not. Maybe there's no evidence. Maybe I'm such a good criminal, I hid all evidence that relates me to the crime. As a result, maybe no one has a reason to believe that I robbed the bank, even though it's true that I did rob the bank. Okay? So Descartes is able to doubt a belief, even though it's true. He's able to give you reasons to doubt a belief, even though it's true. So to put it all together, you're taking a true belief, like my senses are trustworthy. You are taking that true belief, doubting it, and because it is presupposed by lots of other beliefs, right? You are giving yourself a reason to doubt these other beliefs. These might be true too. The other beliefs might be true too, but you are undermining the justification for those beliefs, despite their truth, by undermining the basic belief that they presuppose, despite its truth. So it's all about justification. It is all about reasons for holding a belief. Truth has nothing to do with it whatsoever. So that, in a way, is the key to understanding the first meditation. Now, I can see that I've only gotten about 2 paragraphs into the first meditation, and we've run out of time. So this is like a real class now. Next time we are going to finish talking about the first meditation in our real live class, and we are also going to start the second meditation. But remember, you should reread the first meditation, line by line, paragraph by paragraph. Make sure you understand the basics of Descartes' text, using all of this as a guide, keeping in mind what a meditation is, how it's different from other literary forms, okay? Keeping in mind the idea that you're going to be doubting something, keeping in mind the idea that truth is different from justification, and keeping in mind the idea that beliefs can presuppose other beliefs. If you put all that together, you will have a good notion of what Descartes is up to in the meditations. Okay, goodbye for now.